Good evening. My name is Selena Joffrey, and I'm the Director of Business and Policy at Asia Society Texas Center. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight's program is part of our COVID-19 New Reality series and addresses the topic of the impact of COVID-19 on Asian Americans. A new report from McKinsey Company shares that Asian Americans have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Unemployment among Asian Americans has more than quadrupled, and Asian-owned businesses are overrepresented in sectors that have been hardest hit by COVID-19. Asian Americans are more likely to live in multi-generational homes and hold high-contact essential jobs that place them at greater health risk. How do we gain a better understanding of the experiences and challenges of Asian Americans, and what action can be taken to spur their recovery and promote greater equity? To address some of these topics, we have two of the report's authors with us this evening. Elaine Dang is an engagement manager at McKinsey focused on public sector and organizational health, including diversity and inclusion. Harrison Lung is a partner at McKinsey Company. He's a core leader of Asians, a diversity and inclusion group within McKinsey, aimed at fostering and advancing of Asian Americans in the workplace. Our moderator is Dr. Stephen Kleinberg, founding director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research and professor of sociology at Rice University. Through the annual Kinder Houston Area Survey, which was launched 40 years ago, he has tracked the economic outlook, demographic patterns, experiences, and beliefs of area residents during a period of remarkable change. Following the program, we'll take some viewer questions, so please share your questions via the YouTube comment box. Before we get started, I would like to share that Asia Society is an educational institution promoting cross-cultural understanding for a more inclusive world. Because we believe in the importance of having access to diverse communities and perspectives, many of Asia Society's programs, like this one, are free. Please consider supporting our work through a tax-deductible gift by texting Asia Society TX to 243725. We hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
I'm delighted and honored to be here. I'm a great fan of all the work that Asia Society Texas has been doing, and it's interesting that Elaine is in the office in San Francisco and Harrison is in the office in New Jersey. Halfway between is Houston, Texas. And Houston has been transformed dramatically by the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians, while the Anglo population, growing like gangbusters during the oil boom years, has basically stopped. And all the growth of the city has been, this biracial southern city has become one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the country. And a big part of that, 9% of the total population, is Asian. So as Asians we have a wonderful opportunity tonight to explore how the experience that Asians are encountering wherever they are in this country, and especially now with these three cities, and to get a sense of where they are, where the issues are, what we need to know. And you guys have just done this very interesting study, trying to measuring what is the impact of this pandemic on the Asian populations of America. And so let's start with that sort of broader question of just, what's a basic summary? What did you find? What were you surprised by? What was the reason for writing for doing this report? What do you want us to remember, and what surprised you the most as you did this work? Harrison, why don't you start?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Kleinberg, for having myself and my colleague Elaine in sharing our story and our report with you and the rest of the Asia Society constituents. First of all, let me share the reason why we wrote this report, and then maybe Elaine can share a little bit of the initial insights and interesting factoids that we found. Upon the onset of the pandemic, McKinsey as one of the leading global and preeminent consulting firms that's very much based on research, facts and figures, wanted to ensure that we have a consistent fabric to work off of and ensure that everyone understands the impact of COVID-19 to not just the economy as a whole, but to different slivers of the society. As such, ourselves, the Asian Americans, have worked also closely with many of our colleagues representing the Black community, the Hispanic and Latino community, etc., to share and shine a light on the impact on their respective community. For the Asians in particular, we felt that this was very important because many of times the Asian community are often not talked about and underrepresented, particularly when we talked about it in the media circles and in the public view. We want to share some of the celebratory facts, the fact that we are overrepresented in some of the frontline workers, and some of the plights that we actually experience as a community, and shine a light so that everyone's aware and actually create a set of solution as we go towards the recovery efforts for the broader community.
Great, Harrison. Thank you. Elaine?
Yeah. Thanks so much again, Harrison, Dr. Kleinberg. I think to build off of Harrison's great introduction about our reports, one of the areas we started with when we were looking into insights was we actually wanted to survey, like, what do we mean by Asian Americans? That is a term that we often use, but we really wanted to dig deeper and understand what is the boundaries of that, who do we actually include, and what do we mean? Because we make up about 6% of the U.S. population, which may seem small, but if you read a report and if you understand kind of the Asian continent and all the folks within that, our groups we looked into, it included about 100 different languages, people from all across the continent, Southeast Asians, South Asians, East Asians. We also looked into Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. And this, for me personally, was one of the starting points I wanted to go into. I'm personally Vietnamese, Chinese, and growing up being Vietnamese was kind of a lesser known kind of group within the US. And so I've always seen the Asian group as not a monolith, right? I knew that the Vietnamese community was very different from the Japanese community. But I saw that a lot of my peers and folks who were talking about Asian Americans didn't really understand that. So that was kind of where we started. We really wanted to understand what is this group. And what we found was pretty stark. It kind of, I think, the data aligned to what I had always felt, but having the numbers was actually quite compelling and helpful. So one thing that we saw was that Asian Americans actually have the highest within group income inequality. It just showing how stark within our group and how spread out each sub-Asian group is really kind of shaped to us the differences within Asian Americans and how we are in fact not a monolith. And so that was kind of our starting point, and one of the insights that I think was really personally compelling to me, and something that we consistently hear from folks who read the report, was something that it was great to kind of see with data in our McKinsey report to support that that narrative that people have been seeing across the country. So that was big for me personally.
Yeah, the sort of stereotypes we all have of the model minority, right? There's no problems. They've all come from upper middle class backgrounds. They're making more money than the Anglos. They're enormously successful, hiding some very real challenges, that especially refugees coming from Vietnam, especially, but also Cambodia, the survivors of the killing fields are facing enormous challenges, unlikely to receive the kind of help they need from a community that thinks all the Asians are doing great, and in a language that they can understand, because they also tend to come with much less English fluency. So did you find that? Were there clear differences within the Asian community by exposure to and vulnerability to the pandemic and to COVID-19, and what are the lessons from that, I guess, is one of the questions to ask.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think in our report, what I thought was actually very interesting is we found that there's a overrepresented percentage of people, of Asian Americans, who are doctors and nurses and medical professionals. So these are, as you would call it, educated people, but at the same time, also on the front line, risking their lives, right? and in some cases also being hampered and facing anti-Asian sentiments too, right?
Right.
On the other hand, you have a number of low-wage workers, typically working in hospitality, restaurant services, et cetera, whom, in many cases live paycheck by paycheck, who may not be the most educated, and also getting tremendously hampered. And then the third pillar to this is you have a large number of small business owners who are also of Asian American descent, right? Again, these are typically accommodation services, personnel health and spas and things like that, hair salons, as well as restaurants, right? And they are also being hampered because of the inability to get government loans and support because of lack of relationship with traditional financial services institution, lack of access because English may not be their primary language. So I think we actually see the Asian American community being challenged and hampered across a number of different dimensions.
Across the board, interesting. Elaine, what's your sense?
Yeah, I think to build on that, I think to your question of Asians are not a monolith. So what do we see in terms of different outcomes? I will tell you, me, Harrison, and our whole amazing authorship team dug around looking for data. We were like, let's actually try to find the data and break it apart. And to be frank, it was very difficult to really, and this is kind of one of the key messages of our report. So when we wanted to look at COVID-19 deaths and contraction rates, some states reported it by Asian subgroups, some states didn't, some cities did, some cities didn't. So it was hard to get a full national picture. But what we did see, for instance, Pacific Islanders are 2 to 3 times more likely to contract COVID-19 in a few states. And these numbers are back and kind of earlier in the pandemic, so I don't know the most current numbers. I live in San Francisco, as you mentioned, and we saw that in San Francisco, Asian Americans were, I think, around making up 13% of those that were contracted with COVID-19, but 52% of deaths. Chinese Americans in San Francisco. So we were seeing kind of the differences between Asian subgroups, but it's so difficult to paint a full picture, which is one of the key messages we wanted to make from this report, is the importance of collecting data and making sure you do disaggregate it by Asian subgroups, because that's where you could figure out if there are underlying differences and figure out different solutions that are targeted to that group.
Yeah, very interesting. One of the points you make is that we tend not to think of Asians as a minority group in the same way as African Americans, Latino, and there aren't there 6% of the American population, 9% of the Houston population. San Francisco must be higher than 9%, but still small, right? Given, and so when you want to, and we talked about 100 different languages, 30 different cultures and countries, radically different religious practices, and it is the Asian community more than anything that is turning America from having been a microcosm of European nationalities into becoming a microcosm of the world. I tell people, it's the first nation in the history of the world that can say we are a free people and we come from everywhere. And a big part of that everywhere is the Asian influx, and it's been just a tremendous thing to watch. But it is difficult to keep reminding ourselves of how diverse this population is, and how many different languages are spoken, and how many different kinds of vulnerabilities there are there. And then at the same time, the other point you make is about xenophobia, about fear of this was the Chinese virus, and say something about that. I mean, how much. How serious is that? What ought we to be doing about it? How do you view that the sort of rise of some degree of anti-Asian sentiment these days, just given the origin of the
business due to fear of COVID-19?
While
at least nationwide, COVID-19 sort of hit our shores around, I would say, March. In many cases, these businesses actually suffered already in business back in January and February. So about a month.
People didn't want to go to Asian business.
Yeah. What we also know, and this is the research that we found, 1/3 of all Americans reported witnessing individuals blame other Asian Americans for the outbreak, and reports of anti-Asian violence and assault have been on the rise. This, therefore, when we talked about mental health, and one of the topics I know Elaine is very passionate in, actually reported 39% increase in mental health support texts from Asian Americans, according to the crisis text helpline in the first quarter only in 2020. So as you can see, it's actually up across the board. Maybe Elaine, you should jump in. I know that's a super passionate topic, at least from your side.
Yeah.
You bet. Yeah, I was going to say that Asians also tend to not want to draw attention to themselves, to not want to call for help when they need it. So the incidence of concern and problems and mental health issues is certainly much greater than what we see in official reaching out to agencies. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, Dr. Kleinberg, I think you bring up a really good point. I think in general, I think oftentimes we talk about within the Asian culture, it is less likely. One, you may just know less people, and your own family members may not be seeking out support through therapy or otherwise. I know I personally went through that. I'm a very open person. I go see a therapist, and it was very different for my parents. They didn't quite understand what that was. So as you can imagine, that kind of replicating across the country as people were dealing with the xenophobia, feeling ashamed to go outside. I know for me, when this was beginning to hit, and I was flying initially before we knew what was happening, I remember being very aware of, is my nose running? Am I looking, do I have a small cough because I just drank some water too quickly? And I was nervous, and this is just one small incident, but something that we did in this report that I thought was the most meaningful part of it, or one of the most meaningful parts of it, was we actually interviewed folks. So we looked for frontline workers, we looked for people who owned small, medium-sized businesses, and talked to them and heard their stories. And one of the stories actually came from a couple who owns a fast food chain called OMG Tacos in Dallas, just to throw it out there. And they shared a lot about how, one, their restaurant was hit early on, like Harrison mentioned, but also that their customers would come in, saying racist things to them because they were Asian, and just how much that, one, hurt their bottom line, right? Hurts their profits, but also hurts their souls and their sense of safety. And so mental health is a huge crisis. And something we had talked about, I think now we all know too well, mental health is hurting all of us across the world, right? With COVID-19 and the lockdown. And it's something that I think everyone is facing. And I think what we saw is when you have kind of this double hit, you have the first hit, which is COVID-19 and stay-at-home orders, and it's losing jobs. That's really hard. And then you have the second hit of xenophobia and hearing these slurs. It just adds to the mental health gravity, which has been really hard to watch.
Yeah. And when you add to that the language fluency problems and being an immigrant in a strange country and already feeling some isolation, and then to have this xenophobia hit on top of it all, no question, we can all imagine what that feels like, and why it makes people even more vulnerable and more susceptible to the difficulties of dealing with this remarkable pandemic that's just going on and on. Finally, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, but it's still going to be 8 months or so before we're back to normal. And I guess one of the distinctions to make, I think, is between we touched a little bit on this earlier, between being an immigrant and being a U.S.-born 100% American citizens with English. And what's so striking to see, and it's been, Asians were the one community that were singled out by our immigration policies to say, never will an Asian be allowed to come to America anymore. Right? It was the Chinese Act of 1882. It was the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan. It was a deeply racist law of 1924 that said Asians are an inferior subspecies of humanity, ineligible from ever becoming American citizens, and Asians were banned entirely from coming to America through the entire 20th century until finally 1965, when the laws were changed. And so it's been this new influx, but the influx has now gone on for about 35 years. And so we've got this remarkable, fascinating sort of second generation of Asians. And say something about that, because that didn't come out as much in that report, but it's central, I think, to the experience of being an American. When you're an immigrant struggling with the language problems, and when you're 100% American, but also feeling a deep connection still to the countries of origin. It's really very interesting to see that you become 100% American, but you remain Vietnamese or Indian in important and significant ways. So say something, did that come up at all when you're looking at this data? Were immigrants more susceptible to these difficulties than the US born, and especially in mental health issues, I would think were. But anyway, that's one of the fascinating things to watch in these surveys that we've been conducting of the rise of the second generation. Just extraordinary people. Much more likely to have close, I'll finish this quickly, much more likely to have close personal friends who are African American or Latino or Anglo. Much more likely to be Democrats now and increasingly support of government programs to help the poor, building these connections to this multi-ethnic world that is Houston in America in the 21st century. The core of it all is the US-born Asians, I think, who are upper middle class professionals often, but also people of color, and feeling a connection to the building of this multi-ethnic world. So that was one of the themes in our research in Houston. Did you see some of that in your work?
Yeah, I think maybe a couple of thoughts, Dr. Kleinberg. I think, unfortunately, in our research, we were not able to separate out between the notion of second generation and immigrants, et cetera, because many of the data that we were, taking a look at was very much from the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, et cetera, which unfortunately did not have that level of granularity. And by the way, which is actually one of the suggestions and recommendations of the report, is the ability and working with our public officials to get that level of granularity and data, so that we can actually, as a consultant, do all sorts of analysis.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Right. But what we
you need to do that. Good.
Yeah. But what we did see is, within the Asian American community, there's vast difference across all dimensions. I think my colleague Elaine talked about the income and the personal wealth, right? It is very, and by the way, for that one, in fact, the top decile to the bottom decile has the largest delta within the Asian American community against any other ethnic group in the US, the biggest delta, okay?
Amazing.
Now, this also shows and actually tells that the delta within the community in regards to education level, right? Access to different services, governmental services, right? Language, etc., right? So many different languages, so many different types, and therefore another one of the recommendations is to ensure this community, which is very big, very diverse, also gets the proper support from the government and programs that are tailored to them, that they can access, that is meaningful to them. Yeah, you mentioned that the U.S.-based Asian American population is 6%. Houston, 9%. The concentration of Asian Americans is actually in many of the largest cities and states within the U.S. Right?
That's right.
It's going to be the metropolitan area, and those, as you know, it is the highly densified cities that unfortunately has been hit by COVID the most, because the pandemic is primarily transmitted based on close contact. So you actually have many Asian Americans living in multi-generation, multi-family dwelling that also hamper that. So what are then the programs and the effects that can actually help these people?
Yeah. So number one, we wish we had the insights, but like Harrison said, there wasn't the data available. I will say, if you were to draw any kind of correlation between language support, something that really stunned me, to be frank, was when we were digging into small, medium-sized businesses and really understanding, what their struggles are and what is the current state. We saw that I think I'm trying to look at the exact numbers. About 4 of the financial relief services offered by the U.S. Small Business Administration, none of those provided Asian language translations on their website. So you think about all the small, your favorite Asian restaurants, the hair salons, the places that you see in the Chinatowns and the little Tokyos around the country. When they went onto the U.S. website to access loans or support, there was no language translation.
Right.
So I just thought back to myself because I have family members who have small businesses. I remember feeling relief when I heard on the news that we were offering support for small businesses, but to know that so many people tried to access those but couldn't read it and can actually understand it is actually just, I think, one component of potential differences in terms of people who may need, language translation.
And again, a distinction between the immigrants and the U.S. born in terms of language fluency.
Yeah.
This third most frequently spoken language in Houston after English and Spanish is Vietnamese, of course. And the Vietnamese community, Harrison, is really exactly what you're saying. It is the most diverse because you have the two waves of refugees. The first wave were the scientists and engineers working with the American government and that ignominious helicopters taking people out. And then came the boat people from Vietnam and the survivors of the killing fields in Cambodia that are coming with enormous challenges and facing terrible threats in their time on the boats trying to get over here, and coming into a place where there's very little attention to and no one can speak the language and one of the things that the Vietnamese do get in Houston and in most places is that because there's that second wave, the first wave of the Vietnamese are successful doctors and engineers, and then they reach out to the people from their country who are facing real difficulty. But those difficulties remain again because the broader community has no sense of the kind of diversity and the kind of challenges that so many face. Kind of diversity and the kind of challenges that so many face. Yeah, so go ahead.
No, I was going to build on that. I think, you talking about kind of different generations supporting one another. I think there's a broader kind of call to action. First, I'll start internally, and then I know for us, talking about allyship is really important. But I think internally, there was a moment, Harrison shared a bit about why this report started. It was quite organic and grassroots. There was lots of different Slack messages and kind of casual conversations. And it really stemmed from a place of, if not us, then who? Like, if no one's going to tell our story, especially in the way that we wanted to tell it, which is to bring together all the data that I had been seeing across the news sites and kind of tell it succinctly with the rigor that McKinsey brings. And really elevating the stories of other, Asian groups. It was really important for us to make sure that we tried as best as we could to represent even the folks who weren't in the room with us as we were writing the story. And so I think you make a good point is that we are not a monolith. We are so different, but we are together as Asian Americans. And, I would also think about Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians as well. So a call to action I have to other fellow AAPI folks is, how can we support each other? Our span is so wide, our disparity is so wide. If you fall on the higher end, how can you support other folks who may not have had the opportunities you've had? And really, recognizing your differences while also, seeing each other as a group together. I think is really important.
And the great thing in the Asian community is that there are resources there. There is this range of expertise and positioning and success that really is an enormously important thing to bring the communities together and recognize that we're all in this and facing some very similar challenges. And then also to reach out to the rest of Americans and have them understand more effectively and better that this is a extraordinary new community of Americans, that are redefining who we are as Americans and what does it mean to be an American. And as we go forward, the big story in America demographically is that Anglos are disproportionately older than everybody else. And the young people are disproportionately overwhelmingly African American, Latino, and Asian. And that's where this new multi-ethnic world is going to be coming from. You can just sort of see it emerging in ways that are really very exciting, but also challenging in many ways as we've seen. So what else?
Well, I would love to talk about, and Harrison, I love when you bring this up in terms of allyship. I'll start a bit and then would love to hear Harrison's thoughts. We have to obviously acknowledge, right, COVID-19 and the xenophobia against Asian Americans is sitting against this backdrop of this kind of, I would say, reawakening of the injustices against the Black community. This article came after our sister affinity group called MBN, so McKinsey's Black Network. They wrote this compelling, amazing report that highlighted the disparities in the Black community. The Black lives and livelihoods were impacted. And in a microcosm type of way, we were partnering and learning from them to write our report, understanding their data resources, their approach. And as I kind of zoom out from that small moment, it's to think through, Asians are negatively impacted. And we need to kind of figure out what are the solutions to bring our recovery. But along with that, it's not a zero-sum game. We need to also partner and be allies to our Black sisters and brothers, folks from other communities who are also struggling at this time. And so I think for me, it's really kind of taught me kind of the allyship is really important. Even in the very beginning, you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act and all the various laws and policies. When we had the Immigration Act, that was through the Civil Rights Movement. So I think for so long, there has been a tie between our communities. And so that's something that I think comes out when we talk about the report.
And maybe just one more additional point of context to build on what Elaine said. As we were doing the research and writing this report, this was around starting April, May, June period, and we ended up publishing in August. In addition to the pandemic, this was also during the backdrop of many of the discussions and topics related to systemic racism in the country. Right? We're right in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we were able to not only learn and work together with our colleagues, but also band with them, with our Black brothers and sisters, in ensuring and having a shared voice, right, to ensuring that us as a community within McKinsey have a set of actions that we're going to commit against, so that for us together that will build a better country in the future.
Yeah. Here. I mean, this is all part. I keep coming back to this idea of that we are, whether we like it or not, in the process of building a truly multi-ethnic society made up of all the peoples, all the ethnicities, all the religions of the world gathered together in one country and in these pockets around the country. And that's really interesting and important. And all of us are minorities, and all of us need to work together to build something, as I say, that has never existed before in human history. A truly successful, inclusive, equitable, multi-ethnic society made up of all the people on the planet. So that what you guys are doing and working with others at McKinsey and stuff is just enormously important, I think. And allyship is critical. And that's the other piece that's been so fascinating in our surveys is not only we ask people, do you have a close personal friend who's African American, a close personal friend who's Anglo, but also have you ever been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who was not Asian? You can see the tremendous difference, obviously, between immigrants and U.S.-born Asians, but the rise of this falling in love with each other and marrying and making these multiracial babies in a way that is really, really striking and important. And again, something that I guess you weren't able to pick up as much in this study, but that's a big part of what's happening in America. And Asians are the most likely to marry outside Asia. I mentioned of all the marriages in the last 3 years involving an Asian, of all the marriages, 1/3 involved a non-Asian, more than any other community. And it's that moving toward this being a microcosm of the world within oneself, as well as across the board, that is an enormously exciting part of what it means, what America will be in the 21st century. And I think what you guys have brought is just very, very valuable. We already have some questions, so I should take a look at this and see what questions we're asking. Hold on. So Sandra asked, all this Asian American grouping is an artificial one, right? Asian American ethnic groups look very different. They, just as what you were saying, we're how many different, 100 languages, 50 cultures or whatever. How do we get more, in cities like New York and San Francisco or Houston, there are large Asian populations, but how do we get more attention on these issues for Asians in other places that are less well represented? That's an interesting point, isn't it? It's easy in San Francisco or Houston or New York, but what about places in Montana and Wyoming and Wisconsin that have fewer Asians? Are there any thoughts on that? Are there ways to bring support systems to bear and Harrison?
Yeah, I have maybe two thoughts from my side, Dr. Kleinberg. And first of all, thank you for asking the question, Sandra. I think it's spot on, right? I think the first is, regardless of which city or state, whether there's a lot of Asians or not a lot of Asians, at the end of the day, we'll need to work very closely with our elected officials to have the right policies and programs in place that are catered to our community, right? Even right now, to this date, Asian Americans are also underrepresented in the higher rungs of business, are underrepresented in elected and politics, right? So in a way, we have to build a lot of allyship with others in order to have policies and programs that actually are helpful to us and our community. I think that's number one. Right. My second thought is what I call the notion of clustering. Using sort of the McKinsey analogy, we have our Asians at McKinsey, our diversity inclusion group, in many cities across the US. We were founded in New York. That being said, we also have different chapters in different cities, including places like Miami, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, so on and so forth, where, of course, as you rightly mentioned, Sandra, there are just not as many Asian Americans. So what we end up doing is to ensure that they're not, quote unquote, left behind, is a cluster of offices that are nearby to them. So for example, our New York office works very closely with New Jersey and Philadelphia, forming a cluster of common programs, common affinity events, agendas, guest speaker series, so on and so forth, that everyone can attend and actually participate in, right? So I would imagine for the broader society, such a concept can actually also take place, because the challenges experienced by an Asian American in New York is going to be no different than one experienced in Montana, which I think was the location you mentioned.
Yeah, that was so interesting to read your reports and say, hey, you're talking about Houston Asians. There's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. One of the next question really picks up on that. Why are there? Do you think it's important to have Asian political leaders at all levels, and why don't we have more of them? And things are beginning to move, right? You can see it, but there is that phenomenon of the glass ceiling, as Harrison was saying, and Elaine, be interested in your views of this. That happened both in business and in politics. You can be in the House of Representatives, but you're probably not going to get to be a senator, or you can be a vice president, but you're not likely. And is that changing? And are you confident that we're moving in the right direction, or is that glass ceiling really solidly entrenched and very difficult to break through?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought, and obviously this is my personal thought, I think that political leaders should represent their constituents. You are there to represent the values and the needs of the people, and so it should represent your constituents. And we are 6% of the population, so you would imagine, if you did the math, it should be 6% of political representation. I don't know what it is. I imagine it's much lower than that. So to the first question, absolutely. I think that we should have more Asian representation. I think, caring and looking at the data, understanding, hearing from Asian Americans is important. Anyone can do that. It doesn't matter your background. You could be an ally, you could care, but there is a different type of expertise and knowledge with that lived experience, right? With being of this background. And that's why I think we talk about representation for all groups and ethnic and racial and beyond, why that's really important. So I think absolutely you need the representation. In terms of why there isn't, Dr. Kleinberg, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. For me personally, and again, I'm divulging all my personal information here. I have thought about running for office in the future, some point. Yes. At some point, because of that very question, and that very, I've always thought to myself, why isn't there more? And it's incredible. Our future vice president will be half South Asian, which is really exciting, and that's a great role model for me. And so I think it's kind of up to us. Right. This generation to really step up. And if you're asking yourself why, and you have the excitement and the momentum, then you should also just do it, or encourage someone else to.
I have a couple of thoughts. Right? I think first is, just culturally, right?
Yeah.
Well, even when I was growing up, at never given point in time, my parents were like, okay, please be an elected official.
Go out and give speeches.
It was always be a doctor, be a lawyer, be an engineer, an accountant, some variance of that. So I think even as we were, growing up, it was never really taught to us that, this is let's call it a viable profession. I think that's number one, right? And number two, in general, the notion of civic service and civic duty is not that big in the Asian American community, right? Which, looking at hindsight, it is actually one of the most important things to do. It is a right as an American to vote. It is a right to run for public office, so on and so forth, right? And I think the third thing, which because of these two things, you end up having a lack of role models. People who are, either in elected capacity in the House and the Senate, so on and so forth. It is then when you have those role models, then the next generation will come, right? The analogy I would use is, 30 years ago, there were no players of Black or African-American descent that played golf until Tiger Woods came along. And when he started playing golf, the whole, a whole group of people that said, oh, if he can do it, I can do it. And I think this analogy is actually very similar for Asian Americans, in politics, right? We have a number of elected officials in the House and the Senate. We now have one who is the future vice president and potentially more in the future cabinet. So we'll see. It will take time, but we'll see.
But there is a sense of we're moving inevitably we're moving in that direction. You can just sort of see it every year.
Just to build on one more thing, I think I always balance between like the individual kind of role model and pushing yourself and seeing others around you. And then I balance that with kind of systemically what's going on. And I don't know, these are all kind of my hypotheses, but I know there are groups out there that are more political and support kind of people to rise into political roles. And so I'm wondering, those organizations are out there, those people, are they looking at Asian Americans as well? Mm-hmm. There could be also other factors as to why we may not see it in our view as a possible career that may also extend beyond kind of the personal role model around you, but maybe kind of how organizations are framed and who they look after in terms of thinking about the next kind of politician. Because as you know, like RNC and DNC are large organizations. And they have their own strategy as well. So curious.
And you can just sort of see this country moving and redefining itself in these various ways. And congratulations to you, Elaine, for taking that step from saying we need to get do this.
I'm not doing this now. This is like in the future. No, this isn't. No campaign.
But that's so important to say. If not now, when? If not, maybe who? But that's tremendous, and it's already happening. And there are lots of Asian American organizations of various sorts that are stimulating and supporting that effort. We need to, and it's going to happen more as we go forward. We need to help push it along. It's another question, this time from Samar, who says, do you feel that there's a double discrimination toward us Asians when there is a usual reference to Blacks and Latinx being referenced as being left out and with references to vaccines and mistrust, but not Asians and not a recognition? So that's sort of partly what the reason why you wrote this. One of the things that came out of this report is we need to pay attention to Asians also, who are often forgotten about when looking at minorities. And then Sam says, you're so right with mental health as the number one important thing. With parents from India, I can imagine how in our culture there has been a sense of stigma and not being encouraged to seek out counseling. I wonder what steps are being taken for people in our generation and others now, especially with parents and elders that are resistant to seeking help and counseling. What efforts are there in the mental health world to reach out to this group that is more reluctant than others to seek the help themselves? Elaine, that's your bailiwick.
So I think there's two parts to that. Let me kind of speak to the second one. So the question, I guess, is what efforts are there to reach out to our community for mental health support?
Right.
Yeah, and again, wish I could see across the country to see the status. I think a couple of things. I do think, and I've received, and it's been kind of my favorite part of this whole report process, is individuals reaching out to me I think when you have more reports and more people speaking about mental health, and you could see yourself in them, you could hear your own story in them, that's really important, because I think we need to shift our kind of national culture, but also Asian culture around this. So I think more and more articles like this, more and more conversations like what we're having right now with Asia Society, I think is important. And I've been seeing lots of different kind of nonprofits and organizations address this. Another name drop about my personal life. This report has made me really passionate about Asian American issues and thinking about what am I going to do about it. And so I recently joined this nonprofit called Act to Change. And their mission is to address bullying, discrimination, which also includes mental health, with AAPI youth. It's just inspiring to see them. They're bringing in celebrities, different Asian celebrities, to speak about discrimination and about mental health as well. And so I think, again, these are just different initiatives I've seen across the country, from large organizations, from small nonprofits, for trying to change the tide around this. Those are some things that I've seen.
I think the most important thing is that we should all be aware that you're not the only person. You're not the only one.
You're not alone.
You're not alone, right? The notion of mental health challenges affects us all in different ways, some more severely than others. I think that awareness is key. The second one is, can you sort of work with others to do something about it? Meaning, as you mentioned, Dr. Kleinberg, sometimes the older generation, the previous generation, may not be willing, right? And it is up to us as kids, as nieces, as nephews, as family, to talk about it, to share with them even our plights, right, in different ways, and in a way open up their eyes, and hopefully they are also aware that it is okay to seek help. It is okay to get these sort of services, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and then that is across the board. It's also important to run for political office, as you're saying. You got that whole sort of changing of who we are as we become comfortable as Americans, and so many of these prejudices and xenophobias will get weaker and eventually disappear just because they make no sense in a world where we have close friends and relatives, and something like 1/3 of all the households in America that contain an Anglo, 1/3 contain a non-Anglo. So it's not just friends; it's also family members. We're also so it's again we're living in the midst of just really a fundamental transformation, and you can all see it happening, and the role that you guys are playing in this report is to sort of facilitate that process, help people understand better what help is needed to move things along effectively.
I do want to address the first point, which I think is quite complex, and I forget the exact question. I think it was a kind of double hit of racism. Was that about? I think something that we've talked about as we wrote this. So it is right. I think because of the data, because our data isn't disaggregated, because our story isn't often known, people don't think about kind of Asian Americans as a group that may need support and may experience inequity. I think it's really important to us, and speaking personally, that this effort towards equity across different groups, it's not like kind of a fight for each other, right? We're not. It's not going to be one group versus the other. I think it's really important that we don't go into that mindset, but really it's to say, how can we help each other? And I know I'm going to butcher this quote, but the whole idea of lifting one boat rises all boats, and I think that's really important here. So, and when you think about vaccines and you think about how that should be distributed, absolutely, the government should be using data and should be seeing who is the most vulnerable. Oftentimes I think why Asians may be left out potentially is because our data isn't disaggregated. So when you bring it all together, Asians are look fine. And so I think if you follow the data there, you will see no issues. But once you start breaking it apart, you may see, oh, wait, this group of Asians in these types of roles, these jobs. Oh, there's this population of Vietnamese or Bangladeshis here that may need it. And so that's why it's so important to break down the data, because I do think you need to look at the data, but if it's all grouped together, you're going to miss a lot. And so That's my perspective.
So are there groups in America that are contributing effectively and well to that are studying the whole range of Asians and making it evident, picking up on the themes that you were touching on? Are there groups that you look to that are doing this successfully, or do we still have a long ways to go to be able to recognize the disaggregated realities of the Asian experience? See what I'm asking? There's that.
I think back to the point about the disparity in income, right? I think overall there are certain pockets of groups that are doing better, economically, financially. And to me, it is sort of this group that needs to help, right? Whether you're talking about the doctors, whether you're talking about the
have the resources,
engineers, who have the resources, right? Who have, in a way, achieved the American dream, if you will, right? To help, their brothers and sisters.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the remarkable things about this population, right? Is that a vast the majority of the Asians who've come to America are coming from educational and income backgrounds that are far superior to the average background and education of Anglos in America. Never in American history have we seen a wave of immigrants coming with such extraordinarily high levels of resources and knowledge and experience, and they are contributing enormously to the American economy in a whole variety of different ways. And that will contribute even more as we go into this next period. But that's an amazing reality that we've never, always before, immigrants came at the bottom. And they used to say you have 2 or 3 generations to go from peddler to plumber to professional. Mm-hmm. Right? And now you've got one group that's coming as professionals right from the get-go. And that's an enormous strength, both for the Asian community as a whole and for America. You can just sort of see that coming. Well, we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that did we touched on a lot of things here, but why don't each of you sort of tell us what should we be emphasizing more? What did we not talk about that we should? We have a few minutes left to fill out the picture, but it's just what a remarkable community we're talking about here. It's just, I always find that amazing to see, but go ahead.
Maybe just sort of 3 things I would leave the audience by. I think the first is we need to understand and basically get the data, right? I think we've said time and time again during this webinar that we just don't have the granular view. So work with either your company, your elected officials to start gathering it so that you can disaggregate it. I think that's number 1. The second thing is we really need to work together to combat bias and xenophobia. There is no place in this country for any sort of racism, any sort of injustice, and we need to create a safe environment for our employees and for our community. And then I think the third is because of the unique nature and the non-monolithic nature of the Asian community, we need to ensure that there are programs and policies in place that can cater and that can serve this community so that they can be, going back and contributing back to the American society as well.
Yeah, great. Can I just pick up on one thought about, is there any place where the data are being collected? Is there a center for the Asian American studies that has collected enough data so that they're able to provide that disaggregation? Or is that something that really needs to be created? I mean, aren't there institutes that are sort of focused on the Asian American experience? And there's a UCLA Center for Asian Studies. And I mean, is there any place where you can go to that says, here's where you can find the data?
To be honest, I think there's probably bits and pockets in different places, but there's sort of no one, let's call it central think tank, if you will,
right.
That has
the
entire, even for us, even for McKinsey. And I'll share a story that my colleague Elaine, I'm very proud of her for working on that this year. One of the reports within McKinsey is our Women in the Workplace report, which talks about the experiences of women in the professional environment for many years. When they captured the respondents, they don't really, again, right, similar to what we had talked about, break down the Asian race, the ethnicity, right? So this year, because of this report, because of our passion onto this, Elaine single-handedly, spearheaded an effort to ensure even our McKinsey colleagues, which are already very fact-based, research-based,
right.
When they do the research, actually get to that level of detail.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and they listened, they did what you told them.
Based on this report, thank you so much. Yeah, I just feel, I think kind of my parting words, which kind of dovetails to your question, Dr. Kleinberg. There are so many groups out there, and I also hesitate naming some because I know I can't name all. We looked at so many different organizations. We talked to so many experts, people in the field who have been thinking about this issue for many years. You know, the idea of age is not a monolith. We're not just starting these conversations. A lot of activists and people have been thinking about it and have been talking about it for many years. I think what we wanted to do is to bring it more, as much as we can, into kind of the mainstream corporate perspective, because McKinsey has that audience and has that viewpoint. So I just want to acknowledge all the people that come before us that really kind of lay the groundwork, lay the data for us to then take and then learn from and do further analysis on. So just want to thank a lot of the Asian Americans, Pacific Islander groups out there, and everyone else that's just been a part of this long journey.
Yeah, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yes,
Each of us does our
Exactly.
piece. But thank you guys. I mean, this has been tremendously insightful and
Thank you.
and beautiful work that both of you are doing. And we'll need to have you come back in a year or two and report back on how much progress you've been making.
We can turn the tables. We'll interview you, Dr. Kleinberg.
Okay. But we're hoping to go back into the field. And
Yeah.
It's such a remarkable community, and Houston has been just transformed by the most ethnically diverse county on the planet, we think, is Fort Bend County, which is just southwest of Houston. Fort Bend County is 21% Asian, 20% African American, 24%
Wow.
Latino, 34% Anglo. Amazing. I mean, here we are, and that's and the census projects what the American population will look like in 2050, and it's this Houston population today. I mean, so Houston and San Francisco and New York are all at the forefront of what's happening across the country in ways that are very exciting, challenging, obviously not always easy, and always, as we've learned, certainly in the last 4 years, there's a lot of fear of all these changes and wanting to go back to the old America we used to know in the 1950s. But overwhelmingly, people are moving. And the other thing I think that's so interesting in the surveys is that the single most powerful predictor among Anglos of comfort with diversity, of support for immigration, single most powerful predictor is not education, it's not gender, it's age. Younger Anglos that just take for granted, and are the carriers, as you guys are, of the American future. And we older Anglos are sort of struggling to say, wait a minute, what's happening? Why is the world changing so fast? And so it's not surprising that there's discontinuities and problems, but ultimately, I think you've given us even more reason to look forward to a new America that's taking shape even before our eyes. So thank you all so much. Selena, do you want to come back, or I can now I have Selena asked me to first of all thank Elaine and Harrison, of course, for joining us this evening, for the work that you're doing, for sharing those insights with us, and for continuing to keep the faith as we build this new America. Asia Society Texas Center offers over 150 public programs, each featuring arts, culture, education, business, policy, and current events. Many of these programs are free and made possible by the strong financial support of members and friends. So we hope you will consider adding your support tonight by texting Asia Society Text, TX, at 243-725 and make a donation. So thank you for considering that, and then learn about all upcoming webcasts through the Asia Society website, asiasociety.org/Texas. Thank you again very much for your attention, and to our two guests from across the country, tremendous thanks for really good work and important work as we go forward here. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Kleinberg.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Great to meet you guys. Okay. That's it? Do we leave?
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.